In 2021, Sanjana Hattotuwa of the Disinformation Project published a rather scathing piece on the President of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. In the opening of his piece, Sanjana writes of a president with two faces. A president who is now presented as a smart politician, but with a killer past. As Sanjana closes the introduction paragraph, he raises an interesting question. What does it mean for Sri Lanka's democracy to have this two-faced individual as president? In this intelligence report, we are taking a look at the Disinformation Project's Dr. Sanjana Hattotuwa. I'm Phil, and this is the Intelligence Report. That is your chance to be ruthless. During our open source intelligence collection work, we discovered an interesting video of Dr. Sanjana Hattotuwa. This video summarises his work in Sri Lanka. While the audio is not the best, pay attention to what he says.
So I set up Sri Lanka's first citizen journalism website, groundnews.org, in 2006. What I do with the site is to bear witness to narrative stories, issues, people that mainstream media will not or cannot report. We are regarded now as one of the country's best sites for journalism of record, and to not just read but also engage with issues, stories that are critical to Sri Lanka's post-war democratic future.
Unbelievable, right? What we know of Sanjana is the New Zealand version of Sanjana. Most of us have never seen the Sri Lankan side of Sanjana Hattotuwa. And this version is quite the opposite to the New Zealand version. Over in Sri Lanka, Sanjana's modus operandi is to fight against mainstream media narratives.
That mainstream media will not or cannot report.
Yes, in Sri Lanka, Sanjana is a citizen journalist. We can establish that in 2006, Sanjana founded a citizen journalist website called Ground Views. It is on this website that Sanjana has published numerous articles, many critical of the government in Sri Lanka. Sanjana describes his journalism as pushing the boundaries of what could be said.
We have now about 600 different authors, very few of them journalists, coming and giving us content both of a textual nature, but also in terms of audio and video as well. We've really, my background is English literature, so I've really kind of tried to push the boundaries of what journalism is also about in our country, both during and after war. So we've done really interesting stuff, inspired by, for example, The Onion. We did a series called Banyan News Reporters, which really pushed the boundaries of what could be said.
But Sanjana wasn't just a citizen journalist pushing boundaries. In most of his bios across the internet, Sanjana describes himself as being a pioneer of social media activism. Sanjana writes, "I pioneered both the use of social media for activism and online citizen journalism / civic media in Sri Lanka, including setting up South Asia's first Twitter and Facebook accounts for civic media in 2007. From Sanjana's position as a citizen journalist and social media activist, Sanjana argues that a lack of information, the void left by what mainstream media will not cover, builds an information landscape of myth and fiction. And it is this landscape of myth and fiction that the government uses as its operating principle."
I think information fuels discussion and debate. I think without information, what often happens is that myth and fiction takes over. Fiction is great as a genre that you can buy off a bookshelf. It becomes very dangerous when it becomes the operating principle for governments and governments to base policies on.
This myth and fiction generated by the lack of information, Sanjana argues, forms the bedrock for violent conflict.
The lack of information, I think, is the bedrock for violent conflict, to be very honest with you.
Again, from the position opposing mainstream media, Sanjana argues that information must be accessible and usable to allow citizens to fulfill their function as citizens and to hold their government to account.
And the availability, the usability of information is what compels citizens to be citizens and to hold their governments accountable.
This is a very profound argument, and I couldn't agree more. Sanjana is arguing for free speech. He is arguing for the ability to push the limits of journalism. because it is necessary in a civil society to prevent violent conflict. History would tell us that censorious regimes often become violent. In fact, Sri Lanka's civil war past was a result of discrimination along racial lines. Sanjana's place and time in history, growing up amidst the Sri Lankan civil war, has given Sanjana a perspective in which he sees the importance of freedom of expression to ensure that the citizens are informed, one way or another.
And this is why I think, in a sense, Ground Views also is regarded as one of the sources of information that gives and empowers citizens to ask the questions that are critical, that need to be asked in a democracy. None of us have any kind of sole ownership of the truth, but information in the public domain, accessible and usable, is what helps us ask the questions and perhaps, in time, get the answers that we desire.
What happened to this Sanjana when he came to New Zealand?
Dr. Sanjana Hattotuwa from the Disinformation Project.
Researcher Sanjana Hattotuwa, thanks very much for being with us this morning with your research.
Sanjana Hattotuwa, thank you so much for your time this morning from the Disinformation Project.
We can see that Sanjana's entire modus operandi has been inverted. We know that in New Zealand, Sanjana works for the Disinformation Project, a project initiated by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. We know that the Disinformation Project continue to work alongside the government, advising them on what they call the information landscape. We have seen the potential for political bias within the organisation, which would account for the biased nature of their reporting. We can also see the Disinformation Project's work cited in government documents concerned about shifting of social norms around current political issues. Sanjana has made numerous appearances on government-funded mainstream media, where his well-spoken rhetoric tends to overinflate the significance of issues, but nonetheless sets the narrative. In this Official Information Act response, we can see that the Disinformation Project has also had some form of active role in censorship. Reports produced under contract to the DPMC have a heading titled Appendix 3, TDP's work to report and flag content to minimise harm to New Zealanders. Unfortunately, we don't get to see exactly what is under the heading due to a redaction. They don't want us to see that part. But we can be certain it is being framed as virtuous or heroic that these people must be censored. It is always for our own good. Just trust them. So what does all this mean? In the Sri Lankan version of Sanjana Hattotuwa, we are presented with a citizen journalist, an activist, taking on social media and the government, fighting against the approved narrative in order to prevent violent conflict. In contrast, we have seen the New Zealand version of Sanjana Hattotuwa, this time working closely with the New Zealand government to set their and propagate that narrative on government-funded mainstream media. This is quite the contrast. And it is difficult to reconcile why someone who was so passionate about countering the mainstream narratives would become the very one who was setting the mainstream narratives and contributing to the censoring of citizen journalism in New Zealand. It is difficult to understand why he would contribute to creating a void in the information landscape, a void he said would lead to myth and fiction. A type of fiction that Sanjana suggested would be used as the operating principles of government. And that's dangerous, according to Sanjana Hattotuwa. We opened with Sanjana's rhetorical question about Gotabaya Rajapaksa. What does it mean for Sri Lanka's democracy to have this two-faced individual as president? I can't help but imagine that there is an element of projection in that question. I'm Phil, and this has been the Intelligence Report.
Hey kid, don't ever let them get inside your head. They'll tell you what to do in life instead of everything you know that you could get. Don't let them guide your life towards regret. I'll fight for what I love with every breath. My fantasy chance to be